Well, all right. I'd like to welcome everybody to the second general public hearing we're having this week in regards to the zoning ordinance revision. We have members of our consulting team, Tyson Smith and Kelly Cousineau, who will go over the latest version of the draft ordinance. I won't take too much time introducing them. And if you do have any questions, feel free to use the raise hand feature and or the chat at any time along the presentation. And I'm sure Tyson and Kelly can answer it. And if they can't, we'll try. If nobody is able to answer it, we'll definitely get back to that question with you personally. And with that, Tyson, I'll let you go ahead and take it over.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being with us this evening. As Chris said, we opened up what is going to be a several-month process, adoption process or consideration for adoption of the revised zoning ordinance that we've been working on since June of 2019. We held our first meeting Tuesday night. This will be the second public meeting. And following this, we'll have Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council, and we'll go over some of those expected timelines as we go along tonight. For those of you who don't know, my name is Tyson Smith. I'm with a planning firm called White and Smith, and we are located in Charleston, South Carolina, and in Kansas City, and also have an employee in Dallas. Kelly Cousineau is with us tonight. She's also here in the Charleston office, and we've been the primary participants in the update. So I'm going to open things up here, and then Kelly is going to walk you through the changes that have occurred. But before we do that, I thought I'd just sort of do a retrospective here and go over our progress so far, the major changes that Kelly will cover, and then what you can expect over the next several months. So many of you probably joined, or some of you may have joined us in June of 2019 when we kicked things off with the public, with staff. We spent 2 full days in Amarillo meeting face-to-face with developers and real estate interests, and also with staff and neighbors in the public and the city council and the P&Z. And then in September, we had completed the assessment of the ordinance. And that was a process where we went through the ordinance and looked at the things that had been pointed out to us during our kickoff sessions and identified things that the community said they wanted us to look at. We also identified some things that we thought could use some improvement. And we also reviewed, of course, the comprehensive plan, and identified that areas in that policy document that could be implemented through revisions to the zoning ordinance. Then we started drafting, and we brought to you right before the pandemic struck last spring, module 1 of the zoning ordinance revisions. And then we completed module 2 in June and module 3 in October, and brought those last 2 before you under this format. Module 1, in addition to the executive summary and pardon me, and an introduction, we covered basically the foundation of the zoning code, which are the zoning districts and the use table and the use regulations. In module 2, we introduced the concept of historic preservation overlay district, or reworking of that. Kelly's going to spend some time detailing that, but also in module 2, the bulk of the work done there was related to development standards. So those are standards related to site-specific standards related to the development of land or redevelopment of land. So setbacks and parking and landscaping, say buffers and walls, that sort of thing. And then in module 3, we covered a couple of loose ends, including BYOB venues and airport overlay zoning district, and then all the administrative procedures we wrapped up, and then nonconformities in that module as well. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kelly and ask her to go through the big changes we've made. She's also going to give you some guidance on how to review the documents that have the revisions in them. And then, as Chris said, if you have questions, feel free to use your virtual hand or to put questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll jump in and answer them for you. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thanks, Tyson. Thanks everybody for being here tonight. I'm going to start off just by walking y'all through some of the documents that are available for review. Everything is on the city's website under the Zoning Ordinance Revision Project page. So you go on there, and at the top of the list are the final draft documents that we'll be going through tonight. But there's also all of the materials from the previous 3 modules. And Tyson, if you'll click one time, there's a fairly brief revisions overview for each of the modules, and that covers the most major changes in each module. And I'll go over those tonight, just kind of briefly. I'll go through all of those, and then obviously if y'all have questions, we can dig in a little bit deeper to any of those. But if there's anything you see and you want a little bit more detail, the revisions overview is a good place to start. Next slide. In terms of looking at exactly how the ordinance has changed and what's been revised, there's 2 main documents to look at. The first is the annotated outline, which was prepared early in the project around the same time that we did the assessment. And it lays out the structure and format of the revised zoning code. So it's a section by section overview that tells you the new code section, gives you a little bit of description or background. And then it also identifies existing city code sections that will be relocated to that new section in the zoning code. So this is a way of tracking revisions sort of from new to old. Next slide. This next document, a revisions tracking spreadsheet, is sort of the opposite of the annotated outline. On the left-hand side here, you have the sections for the current zoning ordinance, then their location in the revised code there in the center in blue, and then just a brief couple of notes about the extent of revisions made to that section. So these 2 documents together will give you a good idea of where things have been relocated in the current code and then how they've changed. Next slide. So the zoning ordinance itself is divided into 11 articles plus an executive summary that just gives you a quick overview of how to use the ordinance. We've arranged it so that the materials that are used most often is what a lot of people are referring to when they're looking at the zoning ordinance, but the zoning districts, the use regulations, and then development standards. And the more technical, procedural, administrative sort of requirements are in the latter portion of the zoning ordinance. Next slide. So when you go online to the city's website and you download the zoning ordinance, it is a Word document. And if anybody needs a PDF, we'd be happy to provide that as well. I know everyone doesn't use Microsoft Word, but if you are and you open it up, you'll see this cover page for the code. Tyson, if you'll click one time, you'll see at the bottom left-hand corner there's about a little under 400 pages to the zoning ordinance. So it's kind of be difficult to just scroll through and find what you're looking for. Next slide. But in Word, you can go to the view menu at the top, go down to sidebar and select navigation. And this table of contents will pop up on the left-hand side. That will make it a lot easier to navigate through the code. You can just click on whatever section you're interested in. Next slide. You can also right-click on that table of contents and change the heading level that it shows. So if you just want to see it at the article level, you'd show heading 2. Next slide. And if you wanted to expand those out a bit, you can show more headings that way. Next slide. So the use table is something that's in the city's current zoning ordinance. We've revised it and updated it. It's found at the end of Article 2, following all of the zoning districts. And if you look at the use table in the Word document that I just mentioned, it's just in there as an image file, but there is a separate Excel file that's online that you can download that might be a little bit easier to review. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to go through some of the major changes that I mentioned. And again, there's some more details in the revisions overview. And if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand as we go along. First, we have added some new zoning districts, consolidated some existing districts, And we've relocated the city's airport zoning regulations. We've relocated them to the zoning code, and I'll talk in more detail about all of those in a few slides. We've also added a code section for each zoning district, so you can go directly to that district, and there's a description of the purpose of the district, as well as a table that gives you all of the dimensional standards that apply in the district, such as minimum lot area or setbacks, that sort of thing. We've also proposed some changes to the PD district that would not affect any existing PDs. It's just for new PDs going forward. One of the main things is we've proposed to eliminate the minimum acreage requirements to do a PD. Right now, the code is set up with different minimum acreage requirements depending on the type of use that will be in the PD district. So we've proposed to remove those. You could potentially apply a PD district to any size property. With all of the other revisions that are proposed to the zoning ordinance, we hope that they reduce the need for folks to rely on the planned development district to limit land uses on a property, for example. PD districts really are intended for unique developments that cannot feasibly comply with the requirements in other zoning districts. And so we've also noted that PD districts should, or they have to demonstrate a higher degree of design quality, accomplish an important public purpose, and be consistent with the Amarillo Comprehensive Plan. The revised zoning ordinance also introduces some new housing types. Most of these are missing middle housing types, such as triplexes, fourplexes, tiny houses, and live-work dwellings. Missing middle housing, y'all may have heard that term before, but it's an affordable housing option, or it can provide affordable housing options in the smaller, or in multi-dwelling units, not always, that are compatible in scale with detached single-family residential. And it does help meet the demand for more urban living options. So these new housing types are allowed in the moderate and high density residential districts, as well as neighborhood service district. As I mentioned, the use table has been revised. Some of the uses have been consolidated. The SIC code, the SIC codes have been updated to NAICS codes. We've realigned uses in some of the districts. For example, a lot of the industrial districts allow certain residential uses, but we're proposing to eliminate that, since most of the time, residential uses and industrial uses are not the most compatible neighbors. So we've proposed removing some of those from the industrial districts, but we've also expanded use types and other options in the districts. Use regulations are intended for particular land uses that might have unique impacts. We've carried forward many of the city's current use regulations, such as the ones related to carports or home occupations, and we've added some new ones like corner stores, event venues, BYOB venues. So these use regulations apply for the use, no matter how it's allowed. So if it's a permitted use, they apply. If it's a specific use, they apply, and everything has to go through a site plan review procedure where staff will ensure that any proposed developments meet the requirements, if there are any, for the specific use. Next slide. So in terms of development standards, which are in Article 4 of the zoning ordinance, these are some of the big changes. The first is that we have updated and added graphics to the code, primarily in the section that talks about how to measure building height, which is what's shown in that example graphic on the slide, how to measure setbacks, how to calculate lot area and density. We've also changed some provisions related to lot coverage. So the current requirement, when you calculate lot coverage, only things that have a roof or a floor, or it's another structure that's not open to the sky, those are the only things that currently count towards lot coverage. What is proposed is to calculate the lot coverage based on the amount of the lot area that's covered by any impervious surface. So notably, this would add parking lots and driveways to the calculation of lot coverage. This implements a recommendation from the comprehensive plan. It helps with community appearance and aesthetics, maintains more open space, and is particularly important in helping to reduce the volume and rate of stormwater runoff, particularly from commercial sites when there are substantial paved surfaces. We have clarified the provisions for fences and walls and when those are required, and have built in an alternative to use buffer yards in lieu of a fence or a wall in certain situations. We've revised some of the parking ratios. A lot of them were carried forward, but some of the minimum standards were updated for consistency with current standards and best practices. We've also proposed to establish a maximum parking ratio, which is 125% of whatever the minimum required is for a particular use. There are provisions for administrative adjustments where the planning director can adjust the minimum or maximum up or down by up to 10% for new development, redevelopment, and change of use, and then by up to 20% for historic landmarks and contributing structures. We've also specified that when there's a building expansion, or in the case of restaurants, an expansion of seating area by less than 35%, there's no additional parking required. So that was one way to sort of help with infill and redevelopment of existing lots. There's also an incentive for infill lots, which are defined in the zoning ordinance. You can get a 20% reduction in parking for infill lots. And there's also some incentives for adaptive reuse of eligible buildings that are located within an adopted neighborhood plan area, like San Jacinto area, for example. If you have a building that's at least 20 years old, or it's a dangerous structure, or it's vacant and hasn't been occupied for more than 3 years, you can achieve up to a 50% reduction in the parking that's required. You also have the ability to provide off-site parking up to a quarter mile away, and also to include public parking spaces in a public parking lot for up to 50% of the required parking. And that will take some tracking by city staff to make sure that there's not overlap, that you're not assigning public parking spaces to more than one business. But it is an incentive to help get some new businesses in buildings that may have been vacant for a long time. We've also proposed some fairly simple outdoor lighting regulations that will apply to new development in multiple family district as well as the commercial districts. There are some exemptions to that, like for 1 family, 2 family dwellings, special provisions for special purpose lighting like sports fields. Generally, the amount of light is controlled by the International Energy Conservation Code, which the city has adopted as part of the building code. There are some requirements or some limitations about how much light there can be at the property line and where fixtures can be located and those sorts of things. We've also updated the performance standards just to bring them up to, modern requirements for air contaminants, glare, noise, smoke, vibration, those sort of things. And have proposed to expand the applicability of some of the noise, vibration, and smoke and particulate matter standards to all of the districts in the city. Next slide.
Hey, Kelly, before you go on, it looks like we've got some questions in the chat and some that want to speak on this slide.
Sure. Let's see.
See, is JT.
Are you able to read the questions, Kelly?
Yep, I'm getting them. Yep, there. I've got them pulled up. So it's a question about.
Hey, Kelly, this is JT from earlier meeting that we had.
Hey.
So if you go back to that previous slide, one of the questions they have is, will you go over lot coverage in detail, more in detail, what that does and what percentage of it can be covered, or is that going to be adjusted to Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yep, let me pull that up real quick.
Oh, sorry, and specifically residential use, not commercial.
Not commercial, okay. So let's look at it, for example. Yep, okay, that's what was in the question, 65% max lot coverage. So yeah, it could potentially, depending, so the question was with changing 65% lot coverage to include drives for residential, will this force developers to make larger lots or make homes go taller? The answer is yes, it could potentially do both. Larger lots is going to depend on you know, the type of product that you're building. But if you're doing one-story houses, it could definitely force larger lots. And then certainly it encourages you to go up rather than out.
Okay. So while we're asking, normally, is it 75% right now? Or is it 65% currently?
Yeah. You know, I'm not sure. Chris or Andrew, do y'all know off the top of your head? I can't remember.
I'm looking that up. Lot coverage in R1 right now is at 45%. Residential District 1 lot coverage is 45%.
Okay, what is it in R2?
R2 is 45% as well.
Okay, so with both of those proposed,
and R3
is
65.
Okay, so R2 is proposed to stay at is proposed to be 65%, and then R1 is proposed at 50%. You said that one's 45% right now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's a little bit of a percentage increase, but obviously you're including more in the calculation. But this, JT, this is certainly something where we could use some feedback from developers. I mean, if that's completely unreasonable or workable, we definitely like some feedback so we can take a look and see if it needs to be adjusted at all.
Okay, and so several of the builders are on the meeting tonight, so I just wanted to ask these questions while we're here. So
yeah, and we also have another raised hand here. WY Ben Home.
Yes, it's Wyben Homes.
Wyben Homes, there you go.
Yeah, you're close.
Go right ahead, ask away.
Well, I was going to answer one of the questions regarding the 65%, which is most of us that are building out here, but was just going to look at, you know, from a consumer standpoint, and maybe it's just the challenge in the top of the hill we've got to overcome with our consumers that are, you know, with this lot coverage change and the availability of what we can put on these lots is going these two-story, which is going to those big metroplex areas that have these large two-story homes. And I guess maybe we're at that curve where that starts happening. I'm just looking at a consumer standpoint of what our residents are looking for when you start minimizing our lot coverage and forcing everything to go upstairs. So just a comment.
Okay.
Thanks, y'all. We appreciate those comments.
I don't see any other hands up right now.
Okay, excellent. Then I will go through the changes in the procedures and administrative sections. The biggest change is that we've proposed to consolidate all of the zoning related procedures into one article, Article 5. So the beginning of that section has some general procedural requirements that apply regardless of the specific procedure, like pre-application meeting requirements, that sort of thing. But then the second part of that article is all of the specific zoning related procedures. So you've got site plans, rezonings, text amendments, all those sort of things. And they're all structured based on a common workflow that's shown on the slide on the right there. So you can open that to any particular procedure you're interested in, see why it's there, when it applies, how you start it, how you move through the process, what the approval criteria are, and what that approval would authorize you to do next. We've also proposed to add a new procedure for comprehensive plan amendments, and this will give property owners the ability to request a change to the comprehensive plan's future land use and character map as it relates to their property. We've consolidated all of the submittal requirements into Article 11 at the end of the code. So this includes a giant matrix of all the application requirements for the different types of applications and procedures. Everything related to an application that's approved by a board, commission, city council will be in the code, and then application requirements for staff submittals like site plans and things that are approved at staff level, that submittal requirements matrix will be maintained outside of the code so that staff can update it as needed. This article of the code also adds requirement for traffic impact analysis. And so let me get to this section real quick. So these studies are required for all SUPs, specific use permits, any rezonings to a plan district, which right now is just plan development district. And so in those cases, you submit what we've got two tiers essentially of analysis. There's a level 1 TIA and a level 2 TIA. And which one you're subject to depends on the anticipated peak hour vehicle trip. So if you're less than 100 peak hour vehicle trips, it's a trip generation memo that just gives some general information about the development, the existing and proposed uses, square footages, number of dwelling units, anticipated trips associated with the site. And so this is really intended as information for the review and decision-making bodies. But it could, depending on, if there are any issues of concern that are identified in that trip generation memo, it could trigger a requirement to do a more detailed traffic impact study. So the level 2 TIA is a traffic impact study, and that is required when the proposed development is anticipated to generate 100 or more peak hour vehicle trips. And so the traffic impact study is a more detailed engineering review. The particular elements are established between, you're required to meet with the city, with your transportation engineer, and get some direction on scoping for the study. And then the study also has to include a mitigation plan that may result in recommended improvements. This could be installing traffic signals, that sort of thing. And so that could be a requirement for a proposed development if there are impacts on the transportation system. We've also codified requirements for technical reports and studies. So this is, the city in certain cases, when a particular development application, maybe the city council didn't feel like they had enough information to make an informed decision about the particular development. They've historically requested more detailed technical reports and studies. So we've just codified that requirement. We've specified what types of applications could be subject to submittal of additional technical reports and studies. And those are all indicated in the submittal requirements matrix I mentioned a second ago. The current requirement for SUPs to come with a report or an evaluation by a real estate appraiser, that still is a requirement, but there are some other studies like engineering studies or noise studies or market studies that could be requested for specific use permits and rezonings to PD district. And then there are, there's also the ability to request architectural surveys, for example, for some of the historic district or landmark designation process. Okay, and then nonconformities, we've largely carried forward the city's current requirements for nonconforming lots and uses and structures, but the current ordinance does not address nonconforming site improvements like landscaping or fences and walls and that sort of thing. So we have added some provisions to just clarify when those types of things are required to be brought into conformance with the current code. One fairly significant change with respect to nonconformities relates to nonconforming uses. Currently, if you have a nonconforming use and it's abandoned or it's not in service for more than a year, then the use cannot be reinstated, and proposed is to change that to 6 months. Next slide. Okay, zoning map. I mentioned earlier some new districts. There's the estate district, which is a base zoning district, and then 2 overlays, the historic preservation overlay, which sort of reimagines the city's current regulations related to historic district and landmark designation. We've also proposed a new urban neighborhood overlay, and I'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. But we've also added, to click one time, Tyson, we've consolidated districts. So we've consolidated R2 and R3, as well as the 2 multifamily districts and the 2 office districts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we've relocated the airport zoning regulations from its own chapter in the code and brought that into the zoning ordinance. Next slide. So we felt that it was important to note the effect of zoning map changes on existing plan developments and specific use permits. There are no proposed changes to existing PDs. The individual PD ordinances will continue to apply. Of course, if you want to make any amendments to those, you follow the procedure that's in the code now, which generally is the same procedure you would follow today. There are no proposed changes to existing SUPs either. However, the base zoning district will change if it's one of the consolidated districts. So for example, if you have a piece of property that's zoned R1 and you have an SUP, your SUP will stay just like it is today, but your base zoning will now be O instead of O1. Next slide. This graphic on the right-hand side here is from the assessment. We looked at the amount of land area that's in each zoning district in the city. And it's really informative because it showed us that the multifamily and office districts are some of the least used districts in the city. And so it made sense to consolidate those into a single district. And so generally with those, the current development standards for the one district, either MF1 or O1, will continue to apply going forward. R2 and R3 currently allow a lot of the same permitted and SUP uses. The development standards, setbacks, that sort of thing are very, very similar. And so it made sense to consolidate those. But the proposed R2 dimensional standards, so setbacks, for example, are the same as the current R3 dimensional standards. So what that means is if you have a piece of property that's zoned R3, essentially it's a name change. You're going to be R2, but your development standards are going to stay the same. With R2, obviously it's the opposite. The name is going to stay the same, but your development standards will actually decrease. So it'll be a smaller minimum lot area, smaller setback requirements. And that'll help limit the number of non-conforming lots that could result from this consolidation. Next slide. So the historic preservation overlay I mentioned is kind of a reworking of the city's historic district and landmark designation process. It could establish an entire historic district with multiple properties, or it can be applied to a landmark, a single property. Generally, it uses the Secretary of Interior standards. And this district is not mapped, but it is available for implementation on eligible properties at the request of property owners or by the city's initiation. Estate is a new base district that corresponds to the future land use and character map designation for estate residential. And we are currently working with staff to review proposed rezonings to that district. Next slide. So these estate district is in areas primarily along the edges of the city where things are starting to transition from agricultural and rural areas into more developed, higher density areas. Most of the properties that we're looking at for rezoning are in the north and south ends of the city and then on the southwest side. But again, we're working through that final list of proposed rezonings with staff now, and we hope to have a draft zoning map out for public review later this month. Next slide. So the urban neighborhood overlay, it's a little hard to see on that map there, but it's shown in the green hatch, and it generally surrounds the central business district, and it does overlap with the downtown urban design district. It applies to all properties within the overlay district boundaries, regardless of what the underlying or base zoning district is. And it doesn't add any limitations. It actually expands development opportunities by adding multiple family dwellings, live work dwellings, and mixed use buildings as permitted uses. Mixed use buildings is just, one or more dwelling units and then some non-residential uses. And it also allows a maximum residential density of up to 50 dwelling units per acre. Next slide. So the airport zoning regulations, we have worked with airport staff and their consultant to update those and make sure that they're consistent with the current airport master plan, the current noise contours that are associated with the airport, and the current approach and departure paths from the airport. These, and we've also added based on input from the city airport staff, we've also added a new wildlife hazard zone that seeks to limit land uses within a 5-mile radius of the airport that could attract wildlife, particularly birds, that could present a hazard to pilots. The airport zoning regulations continue to apply both in the city and its extraterritorial jurisdiction. And it's also going to be shown on the zoning map now. We've updated the GIS layers associated with this so that the city can show the boundaries on the zoning map. Next slide. And lastly, I'm going to go through a few changes to the subdivision ordinance. This has been updated fairly recently, so it was not extensive revisions were not part of this project, but we did make a few, so I wanted to cover those real quickly. The first one is that we have revised the approval procedures and timeframes for subdivision related submittals for consistency with the Texas shot clock bill that went into effect a year or two ago. So that essentially requires cities throughout the state to review and approve or review and make a decision on subdivision applications within a 30-day time frame. We've also revised provisions related to alleys to authorize the Planning and Zoning Commission to determine when they're required. There are some criteria in the code that they consider, for example, how surrounding properties have developed and whether they have alleys or not. We've also revised the requirement for drainage plans for non-residential to apply no matter what. Currently, you only have to do, and I think if there's 3 lots or more, so this will change it so that all non-residential development will need to submit a drainage plan. We've added a requirement for stormwater detention ponds in the airport overlay wildlife hazard zone I mentioned to be designed a certain way so that they remain completely dry between storms. Again, just to kind of to try to limit wildlife in the vicinity of the airport. Next slide.
Kelly, before you go on,
Yep.
we do have JT that has his hand raised. So JT,
Yep.
right ahead.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Had to unmute. You
Yep.
there, JT?
Yep.
Did that work? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So on the drainage deal, is that just for developments, new developments, or if it doesn't have a development and there's lots that are not been built on and they haven't got a drainage on it, do they have to submit a plan for it?
I think it's only when there's new development proposed.
Okay.
That was a current requirement, and essentially we're just changing it from 3 lots to 1 lot. But let me pull that up real quick. Sorry, bear with me 1 second here.
No, you're good. I was just checking to make sure.
Sure. Do you have any other questions while I'm looking for that provision?
I don't, not at the moment.
Okay.
This next slide, we do have a question on the park land dedication.
Okay.
Other than
I
that,
could probably field that one if you want to go ahead while Kelly's looking for the other.
okay. So if you will, so you know, I asked if it was an impact fee. If you will explain that to the builders that are on the
Sure.
call that we talked about earlier. I know you're repeating yourself, but they're here. So if you'll repeat that for me.
You bet. Well, at our very first meeting with staff, this was a concern that was raised that as new subdivisions are being built, that sufficient parkland is set aside to meet at least neighborhood and some community level park demands that are being created by the new subdivisions. The city has also been in the process of creating a new parks master plan. So what we've done is we've created a more formal process for evaluating at the time a subdivision is approved what the proportionate share demand being created by that subdivision is for new parks. So the idea here is that the proportionate share related to that new development would be the only thing the city could require a new subdivision to include. We drafted it so there's enough flexibility that if they wanted to provide that through a contribution, a financial contribution, they could negotiate that with the city. But this is not an impact fee or even a fee in lieu in the sense that there would be a fee schedule that people just come in and pay and move forward.
Okay. So is there one of the questions I was asked, is there a plan to like maintain those parks once they're in, or is that part of this fee too?
We did not include, well, it's not a fee. It's just for, I should pull it up actually and look at it, but I think it was just for land and improvements is all that the developer would be responsible for. Let me pull it up and look at the language again while we're talking though. We talked about handling maintenance a few different ways, so I want to make sure. Okay, bear with me, it's opening up here.
Oh, you could.
Tyson, I don't know if you can see a question raised by Paul Davis as well.
Okay, I can see it. Is that in the chat? Is this related to this is not an impact fee? Can you explain the difference? Paul, is that your?
Yeah.
Okay, let me pull this up and I'll address that as well. Okay, so yeah, so at the end of the day, some of the terms that are used in different parts of the country and in different states will vary. And at the end of the day, I don't know that it's going to make a difference to a developer, whether we call it a fee in lieu or an impact fee or a dedication. But we know that the city can't require a developer to provide, as part of a subdivision approval, anything more than the developer's proportionate share. So we've included in here a fairly detailed manner for that to be determined on a case-by-case basis. How many people are there? How many lots are being generated? What is the demand being created? So we provided for only the provision for land and amenities. Okay. Now, the thinking, I think, is that since most subdivisions, most land is subdivided in Amarillo very close to the same time that it's developed, that it's really just part of the same process, that ultimately a park would be provided. So it'd be, the land would be set aside, dedicated to the city, and it would be improved, so it's usable. But after that point, it's up to the city to maintain it, unless they entered into some kind of an agreement with the developer at that time. Now, what you'll see in here is we've included means of compliance, and we do have land dedication, private lands, and then also monetary contributions. So that's saying that, you know, the applicant could say, look, this is too much. We don't have enough land here, or we don't want it right here. We'll just pay for our proportionate share to meet that demand. Then you'll see, and I see why the question's coming up now, a section here that says fees in lieu, because I guess there have been some discussions locally of whether there should be a fee in lieu of parks adopted. And in our point of view, fee in lieu and impact fees are the same. They need to be based on a specific study. So we included this paragraph here that said they may be made by an applicant pursuant to a generally applicable fee study, which would be a fee in lieu or an impact fee, supported by a master plan and proportionality study adopted by the city if applicable. So that's not in place today. So I suspect that the process now is going to be very similar to what you have now, but hopefully it's more formalized. So, so the parks director and the planning department and the county engineer, the city engineer, and then the developer are all working off the same set of requirements to determine what the dedication for parks should be.
Okay.
So JT, number one, did that answer your question? And I'm gonna unmute Paul here to make sure it answered his question.
It did for me. I just wanted to get a clarification, because today when I presented it, I just wanted to make sure I was presenting it correctly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And rest assured that the nuance doesn't get past us. I see the point. I can see how, if I'm from the developer's point of view, it's an impact fee, it's a dedication, it's still going to be an upfront requirement.
For me, this is Paul. I guess I kind of get the answer. It really sounds like we danced around the impact fee wording and we're just calling it something else.
Well, it's not dancing around it. It's just that it's a different tool. If you go with an impact fee, there needs to be a study that studies the entire park system and calculates what the per acre fee or per resident or per dwelling unit fee should be.
What does, for example, like the greenways, I seriously don't know the answer to this, I'm not being smart,
okay.
Like their walking path and all that they would call a park, do their HOA fees not pay that? Does the city maintain that?
Paul, that's part of a public improvement district, and that's how the greenways, a lot of that green space and open space out there is maintained. It's all part of a public improvement district.
So the city,
I think with the exception of the park on the far south end, that is maintained by the city, and the rest is maintained by the Greenways PID.
Right.
And
so,
Paul,
go ahead.
We did provide it here under 2B that if the developer said, look, we're going to have the homeowners association do this, we did provide for that opportunity. So that could be worked out if it's going to remain open to the public, but it would be, it would remain in private ownership. That's that possibility still exists.
I see.
I think one thing that the city has struggled with, and Andrew and Chris can respond to this better, is, you know, getting the parkland, but then making sure that it's maintained properly. But generally speaking, even with an impact fee, you're not going to include maintenance and operation costs with an impact fee. It's just going to be land and amenities, land and improvements.
Yeah, that, you know, that every time impact fees come up for us at our builder association, it's just a scary, it's kind of a slippery slope. It seems like once you open that door, boy, it doesn't stop. And of course, it's hard to compare us to California, but I think out there, I think in California, some impact fees now per lot are like 50 grand. I mean, they're a lot of money.
Yeah, California is an absolute outlier though, but yeah, they can get up there. You know, it just kind of varies. I'd say in some communities, I think the developers prefer a fee-based system because they can sort of pay and play, so to speak. They can write a check and keep moving. But, you know, Amarillo, I can see maybe not being as much that way. But
yeah. Well, so for us, an interesting fact, in the state of Texas, every $1,000 that the cost of a home goes up, 20,000 people are no longer qualified to purchase that home. So, you know, that's our big deal, is trying to keep building costs low. And so that's why we like to watch these things as close as we can.
Sure. Undoubtedly. Any other questions on park dedications or impact fees?
Oh, no, I was going to go back to the drainage thing.
And then let's give Kelly a chance to.
Yeah, if Kelly's found it. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
I did. So it's current requirements in the subdivision code, and it applies to plats. So right now, a plat requires a drainage plan if it has more than 3 lots. So what we've done is add a provision that says if it's non-residential and it's planned to remain non-residential based on the comprehensive plan future land use map designation, then the plat requires a drainage study regardless of the number of lots. So it's not, you know, a site plan, you know, for if you're building a commercial building, it's not a requirement for site plan approval, but it does go with subdivision plats.
Okay. And as long as it's, I mean, it's not like that big of, it's moving from 3 to 1 lot is what I was more concerned with. I didn't know if we were going from, it wasn't required at all to now it's required.
I gotcha. Yep. Right now it's got to have more than 3 lots under the current code.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have at the moment.
Very good.
Well, Tyson, you've pretty much covered this last slide. Yeah, we had some other minor edits just to update department names and staff titles. But those are the proposed changes to the subdivision ordinance. And I think that gets it back to Tyson to wrap it up.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised or questions in the Q&A or anything in the chat. But before we wrap it up here with the procedures and the things we can expect for the next few months, one more chance for anybody to pipe in with a question or something they want to make sure we cover next time we see you.
Okay, so one thing that I'm curious on is when we were combining R3 and R2 together, so will it be a 45% coverage now for R2 percentage coverage?
No.
Or it'll be 65?
It'll be 65 for R2 for residential.
Okay. And then R3 would go with that same amount.
That's right.
Okay. Perfect.
Any other questions tonight? Okay, well, as I noted at the beginning of the our presentation.
Oh, we got one question just popped up, Tyson.
Oh, it sure did. Kelly, can we talk about fencing is how high and measured from? You bet.
Yep. We can definitely do that.
We got that question this morning. Section. We can touch on that. We may clarify.
So, yeah, fences are still maximum height in the front yard and street side yard. So corner lot is 4 feet, and then interior side and rear yard is 8 feet. And when we talked about this morning, there's a section in Article 4, the Development Standards article, Division 2, describes how to measure density, setbacks, and building height. And I mentioned to JT this morning, we may need to change the title of this section because it addresses building and structure height. And so what we've proposed is to measure the height of a building. So the height of a building or structure would be measured the same way that the building code measures it. So it's the vertical distance measured from grade plane, which is defined in the building code, to the highest point of the building or structure. So you're going to be measuring whether it's a fence or a shed or a big commercial building. You'll have the same way to measure height.
So one of the reasons why that's being asked is, let's say there's a retaining wall, like we were talking about earlier today, where like the alley is 2 foot down. That retaining wall counts or doesn't count towards that 8 feet is what they're asking.
I gotcha. Okay. So where I'm trying to picture this in my head. Just so the fence is on top of the retaining wall? Is that what you're saying?
This will be, so the best way to explain it is, so some of these neighborhoods are not on a flat surface. So they'll have basically a retaining wall on the back to bring it up to level. And then from there up is the fence. Well, is it being measured from the alley? Because the retaining wall could be anywhere between 2 to 4 feet, and then the fence starts? Or is it based on the backyard measurement? And then there's also, I'm gonna butcher this with a passion because I know people are listening to this, but basically a curb that's poured in underneath the fence, and then the fence sets up on top of that curve, on that curbing.
Okay, I think it all gets back to how the building code defines grade plane. And I'm going to read this to y'all. It's a reference plane representing the average of the finished ground level adjoining the building at all exterior walls. And there are some provisions where the ground level slopes away from the exterior walls, and there's a reference plane established by lowest points between the building and the lot line and that sort of thing. And I think we do need to just take a look at this again and think through and make sure it makes sense to apply that same measurement standard and the grade plane definition to the measurement of fence height. But it would be great if y'all could take a look at that definition too, and just and see if it makes sense to you and what y'all are having to deal with in the field, if that works. Or if we need to think a little bit differently about how we measure fences and walls in particular.
So one of the thoughts is the definition that we currently have is very heavily written by an attorney, basically. Maybe change the wording to a common language where it's like, I don't know, from the bottom of the fence to the top, something that is easy to interpret, not just by legal jargon. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
And is that a reference? Were you referencing the current definition of height or the proposed?
Yes.
The proposed
yeah, because I don't know what that from the tallest side. I'm sorry, I just don't get what that means, but if there was an easier way to explain it. And of course, keep in mind, I'm not a fence builder. So if that's common knowledge for fence builders, I completely understand.
Okay, well, we've definitely proposed to revise the current definition in the code, and we're hopefully it's simpler, but certainly if it's not clear, again, and particularly as it relates to fences, that we could definitely revisit that. But just this one sentence about height is, you know, it's the vertical distance measured from, again, grade plane to the highest point of the structure. Grade plane is definitely a little bit confusing, especially for non-builders like me. So if there's a desire to, you know, we thought it would make sense because when in the context of buildings and houses, it makes sense to measure height the same way as it's measured in the building code. So everybody's kind of talking the same language. But again, I can see how there might be different needs when we're not talking about a building, that we're talking about other types of structures. So again, we'll take a closer look at that and would ask y'all to do that as well and give us any suggestions you might have for changes.
I will get with him and work on like a definition that they feel is a good one, and then I'll send that over to Chris to get to y'all. Yeah,
that would be great.
Hey, Kelly, this is Paul Davis again, and I'm with JT. I don't build fence and I don't even build houses, but in our group, one of our builders was having a problem, and it was told to this builder that so apparently when you build a fence, it's a board-on-board fence. They put a cap on the top of it, and so typically they'll use an 8-foot picket, and then I guess once they cap out the top, and I may be calling these the wrong things, but it adds 1.5 inches to the height of that 8-foot fence. And this builder was told that will no longer pass inspection, that each of those 8-foot boards has to have that 1.5 inches ripped off the height of it before they can cap it so it stays at that 8 foot. Is it going to be something that's that strict?
It does limit fence height to 8 feet, and Chris might be able to speak to this a little bit better. But we can certainly look at, you know, there's a section that allows certain building features, for example, to exceed the height limit. So I'm wondering if we could add an exception that would allow, you know, a few inches on a fence to allow for the finishing caps on the top.
Yeah, Kelly, this is Chris. Paul, yeah, I mean, our maximum fence height has always been 8 foot. Now, I can't speak to in-field inspections and or inspectors, but we've typically never had much issue with that 8-foot fence height. And so I can't speak to whether a ornamental cap, you know, I guess technically speaking, it is part of the fence, so it would need to be at that 8-foot height. But until recently, we've never been contacted. Planning, anyways, has never been contacted about, you know, a fence that's 1 inch or 2 above the 8-foot max. But as Kelly said, we could look at something, maybe including some language where there's some ornamental features of a fence that can go above the 8-foot typical picket within reason. So yeah, we'd be willing to kind of look at that. And if you guys have any suggestion on acceptable language, send it our way and we'll see what we can do. Absolutely.
Yes, sir. That sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, I picture the labor that goes into ripping, you know, some of these fences and yards are awfully big. And I just picture the labor and the costs involved with that. And it could be just more of a headache than not. You know, the 1.5 inches to me wouldn't be an additional eyesore. So yeah, maybe we can work together on fixing that up.
Yeah, and I don't think that's anything that's out of the ordinary. If should we, you know, allow something like that, you know, we have to allow some things within reason, of course. But yeah, I get what you're saying on a typical 8-foot picket. Then it's labor intensive to cut that down just to strictly stay at 8 foot. But yeah, we really haven't had a lot of issues until recently. But that's why we're going through this process and trying to make it easier for all to use and understand, for sure.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a hand up, and I know I would butcher this name, but McCartwright?
Yes, this is Mandy Cartwright.
Cartwright, very good. Hi, Mandy, go ahead.
Well, Paul has pretty much addressed. I was actually the builder that we were talking about with this fence today, and I mean, if we could possibly get that language in there, because I think Tex-Mex has actually got involved. They're one of our biggest suppliers of our pickets, and the pickets come in either 6 foot, 7 foot, or 8 foot, and it probably hasn't been an issue, but gosh, probably for the last 15-20 years we've started doing the board on board fence, and then it has that top rail at the top, and it makes for a stronger fence, and that's just, I mean, that's what so many of them are going to. And so if we're going to have to end up ripping that off, the expense was huge. And I mean, I literally had an inspector tell me a few weeks ago that he made someone take a skill saw and cut off an inch of his fence. And I mean, I think they've changed that now and said but was telling me we were going to probably have to stick with that 8 foot. And so if we could get that language in there just over that 1.5 inches, it would really, really be nice, because I mean, there's hundreds of fences right now that are 8 foot, 1.5 inches. And so just for material purposes, I mean, if we could order the material in, it would, I wouldn't be opposed, but it's just the labor and the expense. And then also, when y'all were talking, because I talked to Johnny Scholl about this fence. I'm actually in process of building a house right now, and it had become an issue because that inspector had told me too that the retaining wall did count for part of it. But Johnny clarified with me, and hopefully y'all can get this in some of the language, that the grade, like what the house grade was, that your yard can stay level, like out to the alley, if we're having to build up 2 foot to keep the yard level, that that 2 foot of retaining wall would not count as part of your 8 foot, because even some of those that might have to have a 4 foot retaining wall to get the backyard level, if you counted that 4 foot, you would stand in your yard and basically only have a 4 foot tall fence. You would see half of a person. And he explained, he said that's not even reasonable, and that they would take grade, like from your house grade, take it out level, and that's where the 8 foot would start, was the way he explained it to me. So if that language could read in a more simple matter, because I don't really understand because I believe she was talking about the height of the actual structure, but in residential, I wouldn't think the height of the structure would have anything to do with that.
Okay, we're going to take another look at both those points on the fencing.
And Tyson, I can say what Mandy is saying is correct. We typically use, when you typically have a situation, say the alley side of a particular lot, like we were talking about earlier, if that is a lot lower than the grade of the backyard, we typically went off the grade of the backyard, and just typically where that top of that retaining wall would be, or something like that. So, and again, I think we're all in agreement. We want to make this as simple and clear as possible, and I think that's something we can do in short order while still meeting the intent of where we're going.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like everything's being measured consistent with the way the building code says to measure, because the way what y'all just described definitely sounds like they're measuring it based on this grade plane. But again, like we said, we can take a look at it and simplify the language if we need to, and then look at adding some, the ability to go a little bit higher on those fences.
All right, I'm looking here. I don't see any other questions. Nothing else in the chat. Somebody asked, someone else asked whether or not, sorry, I'm reading through the chat here. Okay, we will have the presentation on the website of the city, and also the recording of tonight. So if you missed the beginning or somebody couldn't be here, they can access those that way. I think we've covered everybody. Okay, any other questions? Hit the virtual hand if you're trying to ask a final question, so we're sure to see it. Okay, I will go through our final slides that go through what we can expect the next few months. And if a hand pops up, we'll take the question here in a minute. So this week we've had our public meetings. We've had 2 meetings with open to the public tonight and Tuesday night, as I said, and then this morning we met with Builders Association. There's also been a steering committee or subcommittee that's been shepherding this project through as we've gone along, and we'll be meeting with them as well. And then on the 22nd, we have a fixed date to meet with the Planning and Zoning Commission in a workshop, and that'll be at 3 o'clock. It'll be virtual. It'll be part of their regular agenda, and we'll introduce them to these changes as well. They'll meet again after that to formalize their recommendation to the City Council, and then we're expecting the City Council to hold its 2 hearings in the May-June timeframe. So still some time before us, but it does tend to go quickly, and there's a lot to review. So I would encourage everybody to start making your way through the changes. Refer back to those slides that if you did join us late, there's some slides that are in here that walk you through the revision tracking documents that we've prepared, so that you can go through the document and identify places that have changed more easily. And you can also go directly to an area you're interested in. If it's a zoning district or a type of development standard that you're particularly interested in, you can go at it that way. Send any questions to Chris and he'll make sure they get to us, and one of us will answer them or follow up during one of the succeeding public meetings or meetings with one of the boards. So I don't see any other questions at this point, so I will wrap up and turn this back over to Chris.
Tyson, thank you. And I'd like to thank everybody that attended tonight's meeting. And again, just want to emphasize, if you do have any questions or suggestions or just any kind of feedback, get it to me, Andrew Freeman, who's our director, or Emily, and we'll get those answered the best we can and provide Tyson and Kelly that feedback to see how we incorporate that in if we can. Yeah. But other than that, I have nothing else to add.
All right, thanks and good night.
Thanks everybody for your time. Appreciate it.
Have a good night.